Okay, everybody, good evening. Nice to see you all. Tonight we're going to do something a little bit different from our usual stint. Tonight is going to be a class on stories, essentially, Hasidic stories. And the reason for this is really that stories sometimes are able to convey certain ideas that textbook learning is not going to convey as well. And this is in fact a statement of our sages. The sages talk about that you have to observe the deeds, the acts, how wise people, how righteous, holy people act, not only what it is that they learn, but how they act and how they act in the world, the kinds of things that they do, and the kinds of things that they say as well, which also requires study. So, I'm going to tell you a story about a Hasidic Rebbe. Hasidic Rebbe, meaning to say, I'm sorry, that was the wrong thing, meaning a Hasidic Rebbe, Hasidism was the movement founded by the Baal Shem Tov. Essentially, it's a continuation of Kabbalah, except with a slightly different emphasis. There are three stages, as I mentioned many, many times before. There are three stages of Kabbalah. Three stages of Kabbalah. And the three stages are three real eras of endeavor in Kabbalah. The first era of Kabbalah begins actually with the Zohar. It may even begin before that, but essentially the Zohar is marked as the beginning of that particular era of Kabbalah, and it extends all the way through to Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. The Zohar was written in about the 2nd century, and it extends through all the way to Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the 16th century approximately, somewhere in the 16th century, passed away. So that in that era of Kabbalah, what they studied primarily was the concept of the development of the worlds, developmental Kabbalah, the development of the worlds, as it's called, Hishtalshalut, right? In other words, to a certain extent, the sort of static development of how one thing developed from another, static because it's historical, even though it's present in present reality as well, and it informs and impacts present reality, but nevertheless it's talking about processes which took place essentially in the past. They're still taking place, but which began taking place in the past. As the Bible begins, the Torah begins with the words Bereshit bara Elokim, God, in the beginning God created. So that whole process of creation is explained in the Kabbalah from the time of the Zohar until the time of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Then, also in the time of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, begins the teachings of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the father of modern Kabbalah. So he emphasizes and highlights a whole different aspect of Kabbalah. It was there, present in the Zohar, in fact, but it had not been well explained or emphasized previously. It's the new aspect of Kabbalah, which is called Hitlavshut. Hitlavshut means the enclosement of one aspect in another. In other words, it's not just developmental, but now it's interactive. The interactive stage of Kabbalah and the explanation of the interactions that take place between what are called the partsufim, the various visages. In other words, the various spheros or clusters of spherot, divine emanations, which interact in various important ways, which the Arizal explains and he depicts and he defines. The Arizal lived from the 1500 in the 1500s. He died a very young man. He was only 39 when he passed away. And then subsequently comes the era of the Baal Shem Tov, who was in the 1600s, essentially. The Baal Shem Tov and the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov. He began a group, or the group of followers, which the people who followed him came to be called Hasidim. And these Hasidim essentially followed the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which was a completely new aspect of Kabbalah, and it's called in the technical terminology, Hashra'ah. So first you had Hishtoshalut, and then you had Hitlafshut, and now you have Hashra'ah. Hashra'ah means the indwelling, it means both things, the indwelling and the upon dwelling of the divine presence. In other words, the indwelling of the divine presence in everything, and the envelopment of everything by the divine presence. Okay. So, that was the system of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, from the Baal Shem Tov onwards, the Baal Shem Tov had many disciples, and his chief disciple, the Maggid Mezrich, had 60 main disciples and many other lesser disciples. All of these eventually became Chassidim, or at least the vast majority of them eventually became Hasidic rebbes. In other words, they became sages, Hasidic sages, and spiritual leaders in their own right. And these spiritual leaders, in fact, began various dynasties and approaches to the mystical and spiritual life of their disciples. And each one was chosen by the successor of the Baal Shem Tov. These 60 disciples, again, there was a Baal Shem Tov, then his successor, the Maggid of Mezrich. So the Maggid of Mezrich chose his disciples, each one according to his abilities, according to his particular spiritual gateway, and sent that particular person to a city or to an area where he could have the most influence and the most and be the most useful to the community. For example, there was a certain spiritual leader called the Rebbe Mojitz. For example, the Rebbe Mojitz has absolutely beautiful songs, masterpieces of song. He was given the keys to the chamber of song, as it's called in Kabbalah. He was given the keys to the chamber of song. And these magnificent songs. In fact, I tell the story of one of the Mojitzer Rebbes that this is a night of stories, so I'm just going to weave one story into another until I get to the main point. That one story, one of the Mojitzer Rebbes, one of the more Mojitzer spiritual leaders from this place called Mojitz, the story is told about him that he was actually, this was already in our times, he was in a very difficult situation, probably around the time of World War I, and he was in a very dangerous health situation, and he required an operation. The problem was that there was no anesthetics at that time. There was just no possibility of, because it was wartime, there was no possibility of getting anesthetics. All the anesthetics had been used or sent to the front lines for the soldiers, and he needed an operation, and it was, either he had the operation or he would die. That's what the doctor said. So he told the doctor, the Mojitzer Rebbe told the doctor, I'm going to sing a song, and after a few minutes of me singing, you begin the operation. And the doctor began the operation, and the Mojitzer Rebbe passed on. Now, his son, who became the following Rebbe after him, said that it wasn't because of the operation that he passed away, it was because of the song that he passed away. His soul just flew up and didn't want to come down anymore. It was such a song of such beauty and such depth and such enlightenment that he kind of disappeared. his soul left and didn't come back. So the Mojitzer Rebbe was sent to a place, to Mojitz. He was sent to Mojitz, where there was a tremendous amount of folk songs and people were singers and they were very into singing. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, on the other hand, was a tremendous maskil. He was an extremely deep thinker. So he was sent to those parts of Russia, White Russia, which was like Lithuania area and so on and so forth, where people were very into study and deep thinking and analysis, because that's what his power was. So he was sent there. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Bedichev, was someone who had a huge heart. He had a heart that was bursting with love for his fellow man, and he was sent to a place where that was what they needed, and so on and so forth. Every student was sent to the place where his talents and his particular gateway, so to speak, his gateway to God, because there's many different gateways. The temple itself was constructed with 13 different gates, because there's essentially 13 different kinds of people, or 12 different tribes, and then a 13th gate for those who didn't know their tribes, who didn't have a tribe, for instance, for converts who were not born into a tribe. So it's explained that these 13 gates essentially are 13 different approaches to godliness. All of them are gates into the temple. And you have to go primarily through your gate. Okay. So now, that is the derech, the way of Hasidism. Hasidism, again, was established by the Baal Shem Tov, disseminated by the Maggid Mezritch, his disciple, and his successor. And then the Maggid Mezritch sent out many disciples to many different areas according to what was needed in those areas and according to the ability of their students, of his students, rather. And so it goes on until today. Now, one of the disciples of the Maggid Mezritch was, as I mentioned before, Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi. Shneur Zalman Liadi was a person who, for whatever reason, was born on an extremely elevated spiritual level. In fact, the Baal Shem Tov had said about him when his soul was coming down, the Baal Shem Tov said he spent 3 years preparing for the soul of Rabbi Shneur Zalman to come down. He was the first Rebbe of Chabad, or the first Rebbe of Lubavitch. Chabad, Lubavitch, same thing, right? The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, or the first Chabad Rebbe. Chabad is just an acronym, Chochmah Bina Da'at, an acronym of the 3 Sfirot, the first of the 3 imminent Sfirot, Chochmah Bina and Da'at. And the methodology of Chabad, of Lubavitch, is Chochmah Bina and Da'at, to follow the dictates of Chochmah Bina and Da'at, the intellectual faculties, to develop the intellectual faculties as a gateway to godliness. Okay, so this Rabbi Shneur Zalman, as I said before, he had what was called a new soul, a neshama chadasha. Now, in neshama chadasha, there's 2 types of new souls. There's one type of new soul which was part of Adam originally. All souls, essentially, except very few, were part of Adam originally. Some souls fled from Adam before he committed the sin. When those souls are once again come down into the world, and those souls are very, very few of them that fled from Adam before he committed the sin, but those souls, when they come down into the world, to renew or to introduce a new aspect of Torah, a new aspect of the teachings, a new aspect of Kabbalah into the world. So those few souls that fled Adam before he did, those are also called new souls. But they aren't, so to speak, brand new souls. Brand new souls are souls that weren't even part of Adam. They were loftier than Adam at the time that he was created, And those souls are called Nashamas Kadoshas Mamish, literal new souls. They say about Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi that his soul is one of those latter type of new souls, one that had never been before in creation, not even as part of Adam. And his was a new soul, and therefore his task was tremendously important in terms of the development of Hasidic thought. And you see that Chabad Hasidus, which he founded, is the richest and the most prolific in terms of literature and in terms of depth of Hasidic teachings. That's the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi and his followers, his successors, through to our generation, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who passed away in 1994. So, the story is told, and this is the story that I wanted to get to. The story is told about Rabbi Shneur Zalman and his son. Rabbi Shneur Zalman was called the Alter Rebbe. I'm going to write it down in the chat over here so you can see it. Alter Rebbe. And his son was called the Mittler Rebbe. That was sort of a nickname. The Alter Rebbe means the old rabbi. In other words, the original founder of this branch of Hasidism. And the Mittler Rebbe means the middle one. Why? Because he was the middle one to the generation that gave him that name. They were disciples of a third Rebbe after him, his son-in-law, his son of the Mittler Rebbe's son-in-law, whose name was the Tzemach Tzedek. You don't have to get all these names straight. It's not that important, but he was called the Middle Rebbe because the Tzemach Tzedek was the third one. So 1, 2, 3, he was the middle one, right? That one was the middle, Mittler Rebbe. Okay. So the Mittler Rebbe was the son of the Alter Rebbe. Okay. Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi was the name of the Alter Rebbe, and the name of the Mittler Rebbe was Rabbi Dov Ber. Rabbi Dov Ber. So the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. Okay. So the story is told about the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. Once the Mittler Rebbe, the son, asked his father, the Alter Rebbe, why it is that he goes white when he gives over a Hasidic discourse. Now, what's a Hasidic discourse? If anyone has ever studied Hasidic discourses, you'll see that a Hasidic discourse is an analysis of either a verse or a statement of the sages or a Kabbalistic statement, and they go deep into the concept and explain it from all angles and come to resolve either a question on the verse, on the statement of the sages, or on Kabbalah, etc., by this depth of analysis that they will do. And sometimes the depth of analysis is extremely deep. Anyway, so the Mittler Rebbe asked his father, the Alter Rebbe, why do you go white when you give over a discourse? Giving over a discourse is actually, essentially, it's giving over a meditation verbally. It's giving over a verbal meditation with tremendous depth to it. And if you listen to the mimer, it's called a mimer. A mimer means a saying, an utterance, right? If you listen to the mimer, the verbal discourse, as it goes along, it takes you on a certain path of a spiritual path of thought and feeling, which eventually leads you to where the speaker wants you to go. Right? You follow it so that it takes you to where you want to go, so to speak, to where he wants you to go, rather. So when Alter Rebbe was saying this Hasidic discourse, when he was uttering this Hasidic discourse, or any Hasidic discourse, he would go white. So his son asked him, why do you go white? So he said to him, because my teacher went white when he uttered the discourse. My teacher went white. I'm going to explain the story soon. But then the father said to the son, the Alter Rebbe then said to the Mittler Rebbe, and why do you go red when you say a discourse? Why do you go red? And he said, because the Baal Shem Tov went red. because the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe of your Rebbe, the teacher of your teacher, went red. And that's why he went red. Now I'm going to explain the story. I'm going to attempt to explain the story. There's a lot of depth to the story that we don't realize. It seems like just an interesting story, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. Let me just explain for a minute who the Mittler Rebbe was. Mittler Rebbe, although he was the son of the Alter Rebbe, was a great, great spiritual leader in his own right. When he would give over a discourse, his discourses are amongst the lengthiest of discourses in Chabad Hasidus, in this branch of Hasidic teachings, this branch of Kabbalistic teachings. Again, the latest development of Kabbalah is in Hasidic teachings. I'm sorry. Switch that off. So when he would give over a Hasidic discourse, he would do it for a very long time. There were many, many chapters in the discourse when it was eventually written down. And not everything that he said was written down. So one of the stories that was told about a discourse that he gave was actually told by one of the sons of the Tzemach Tzedek, that third Rebbe. The Tzemach Tzedek had 5 sons, and the youngest son actually became the successor to his father. The youngest son, named Rabbi Shmuel, became the successor to his father, the Tzemach Tzedek, whose name was actually Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, called the Tzemach Tzedek after the book that he wrote. In many cases, people are referred to by the names of the books that they wrote. The names of the books that they wrote, that's their name. So he was called the Tzemach Tzedek because he wrote a book called the Tzemach Tzedek. But his real name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. So, Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch had 5 sons, and the youngest one actually became his successor, although all the his older brothers also became, in their own right, they became Hasidic Rebbes as well. Although the father was not happy about it, he didn't want that to happen, but it sort of happened by itself. He only wanted one Rebbe, but 4 of them, 3 of the others also became great Hasidic leaders. So, Rabbi Shmuel once asked his older brother why he was given the nickname, why the older brother was given the nickname of the Stender. Stender, let me just write it here. What's a Stender? Stender is a lectern, right? Stender is a lectern, like a table that you lean on when you're giving a lecture, right? The table that you have your notes on. Or the stand, Stender, from the word standing. So he asked his older brother once why he was called a Stender. So he didn't want to tell him. He was embarrassed. He didn't want to say anything. He didn't want to appear to be vain or anything like that. He said, I don't know, I just got the nickname somehow or another. So the Rabbi Shmuel said to him, it's not possible. It's not possible that you would be called such a nickname unless it was some kind of unusual circumstances. What were they? So the older brother didn't want to tell him at first. But eventually he pressed him until eventually he told him the story that once when they went out into the fields with the Mittler Rebbe, he was the great nephew of the Mittler Rebbe. Well, actually, no, I suppose he was the grandfather on the mother's side. He was the grandfather on the mother's side of this son of the Tzemach Tzedek, right? Because the Mittler Rebbe's daughter married the Tzemach Tzedek. Okay, so the older brother said, because once when I went out with the Mittler Rebbe into the fields, they would go out into the fields in the summer, he leaned on me to say a discourse, a Hasidic discourse. So Rabbi Shmuel was very sharp, and he said, what do you mean he just leaned on you? He leaned on you, you're going to get the name of the lectern, the Stender, because he leaned on you for a minute or two, or for a few minutes. Come on, that's not the reason. Let's hear what it's all about. Anyway, he pressed him. Eventually it came out that the Mittler Rebbe leaned on this young boy who was only 16, 17 at the time. He was leaning on him for 18 hours. 18 hours, right? He said his discourse for 18 hours. So that's who the Mittler Rebbe was. He said a discourse for 18 hours, probably about 102 chapters of a discourse of extremely deep teachings. So, again, so the main story that I want to talk about is the story where the Mittler Rebbe asks his father, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, why is it that you go white when you give over a discourse? And the Alter Rebbe answered, because my teacher went white, but why do you go red? And he answered, because the Baal Shem Tov, when he said a discourse, he went red, and that's why I go red. Now, let's just understand here what kind of thing we're talking about. When does a person go white? A person goes white when the blood drains from your face, right? When there's no blood in your face. That's when a person goes white. For example, if a person gets an extreme fright, you go white, right? Yes? If a person is perhaps very weak or tired or whatever, he will be more white. If a person is energetic and perhaps in a case of angry, he would also, embarrassed, he would go red. Like red is a sign of blood flushing into the face, right? So why was it that the Alter Rebbe went white and the Mittler Rebbe went red? What does this represent? So, possible answers are as follows. Excuse me, let me drink a tea. Possible answers are as follows. The methodology, the approach of the Alter Rebbe, the one who went white, his approach was to sort of climb into the heavens to understand what was going on in the heavens, so to speak. We said before that his soul was a new soul. And if you look in his discourses, there's many books of his discourses. The most famous ones are called Torah Or and Likutei Torah. If you look into almost every discourse in Likutei Torah, and many of them in Torah Or as well, somewhere in almost every discourse, he's going to ask the question, why did the soul descend down below? What was the purpose of the descent of the soul? And this seemed to be something, because he mentioned it in almost every discourse, seemed to be something that really bothered him. In other words, what am I here for? Why am I here? I should really be up there, right? I shouldn't really be here. I should be up there. And in fact, we see later on that when there was a kitrug against the Alter Rebbe, a kitrug meaning an accusation in the heavens against him, that he was disseminating Kabbalistic teachings at far too great a breadth, in such a way that the heavenly court kind of got upset about it. How can you disseminate these teachings so broadly that even ordinary people are learning them? How can you do that? This is meant for Yechidei Skula. It's meant for especially holy and elevated people and people who've worked on themselves, who've elevated themselves. How can you just spread it out to everybody? So there was a kitrug, an accusation in the heavens, and it looked very, very bad. And the Alter Rebbe said, this is again Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi, the one who went white, he said to one of his disciples, he said, the truth is, I could conduct everything from up there meaning not here. In other words, even if he would be put to death by the Russian government, because that was the how shall I say, the kitrug, the way it came down, the accusation, the way it came down, was an accusation that he was plotting against the Russian government, which was completely laughable. He was a Torah sage, and he had no thoughts of politics or whatever it was. He wasn't engaged in that at all. But that's the way it came down. The accusation came down that he was plotting against the Russian government. And I'll get to that soon, Ernest, in the question section. So the accusation was that he was plotting against the Russian government, and the penalty for such a thing would be death. And things were not looking good. In fact, the opponents of Hasidism, called the Misnagdim, the opponents, the antagonists of Hasidism, who didn't like the ways of Hasidus, had trumped up all kinds of stories about what he was doing against the Russian government. He was sending money to Hasidim that had moved to Israel, and since the country that was in charge of Israel at that time was Turkey, and Turkey was at war with Russia, so they were making up stories that he was sending money to the Turkish army in order to support the Turkish army in their battle against Russia. And things do not look good in physical terms. So he said to one of his disciples that if I pass away from this world, I'll be able to run things from up above just as well. I'll be able to run things from up above just as well. In other words, in the higher spiritual worlds, his soul will ascend to the higher spiritual worlds while his body dies down here below. But nevertheless, there's a lot of advantages in running things down here. So if someone was very familiar with the higher world, and it wouldn't really have bothered him all that much had he not been in this physical world. And in fact, as I mentioned in his discourses, he always asks the question in almost every discourse, why on earth did the neshama come down? Why did the soul come down to the body? What is the purpose? Why? Right? Why couldn't the soul simply have stayed up there? What did it come down here for? And he answers, there's various answers that he gives. If anyone wants to look, you'll find it in Tanya. One of his seminal work is called Tanya in chapter 36. He explains. But in any event, this was his question. Why should we be down here? It would seem natural that the soul should be up above. And this is probably because he was a new soul, in other words, an extremely elevated and lofty soul that really was not a worldly soul at all. It didn't seem to fit very well into the world. So the reason that he went white, we could say, is because when he was in the middle of a Hasidic discourse, his soul ascended up on high to its root. It ascended up on high to its root, and therefore the blood, so to speak, left his face because he was elevated up into a higher spiritual plane. And therefore the blood, which is the sign of living in this world, right? The person lives, someone who doesn't have any blood is not going to live. So the blood is the sign of life, right? Blood is the sign of life, which is why we're not allowed to eat blood in Jewish law. It has to be removed. If you're going to eat meat, which we're allowed to eat, but you're not allowed to eat the blood has to be removed by salting, by a process called shchita, the way the animal is slaughtered to let most of the blood out, and then salting to get the rest of it out, whatever. In any event, let's suppose that let me say it slightly differently. I'm making the proposition that the reason that he went white when he said Hasidus is because he had an ascent of soul. Why did the Mittler Rebbe go red? Because the Mittler Rebbe, even though he's an extremely, extremely lofty soul as well, but his direction in things was completely different. His direction was not to ascend up to the root of his soul, but rather to bring the root of his soul down to life in this world, bring the root of his soul down here. And that's why he went red. The blood flowing through his veins was now being pumped up, so to speak, by the presence of a much higher level of consciousness that entered into him as he was down in this world. Now we see several stories that are told about him that illustrate this idea. He was very, very much into prayer. His father was much more into Torah study, although he was into prayer as well, for sure. But the Mittler Rebbe was so into prayer that at times there's a story told that that he had an attendant who would take care of his arrangements in his office and so on and so forth. And this attendant, called a shamash in Hebrew. So this attendant would once called in some of the Hasidim to the room, to the synagogue, where the Mittler Rebbe was. He would down for hours. He would pray for hours. It wasn't just prayer; it was meditation and prayer together, obviously. But he would meditate and pray for hours. So he brought the Hasidim into the room, and they saw that the Mittler Rebbe was standing up, leaning against a pillar. There was a pillar in the middle of the room, and he was leaning against the pillar. So the shamash, the attendant, said, "Let me show you something." And he shouldn't have done this. That's the truth. Is it was disrespectful what he did, but nevertheless he did it. He went and he grabbed the Mittler Rebbe and he swung him, he spun him around. And the Hasidim were immediately startled because they saw that he had his eyes open, but he was totally not there. He was totally not there. He was in a state of reverie. He was in a state of trance, right? Then the Gabbai, the attendant, swung him back again and put him leaning up against the wall. And no one even noticed. I mean, the Mittler Rebbe didn't even notice that people were in the room, out of the room, and so on and so forth, that he'd been spun around. He had no idea. Now, you might think that is because his soul had ascended on high. My suggestion is it's the other way around. The on high came down into his soul, and he was so absorbed in it, completely absorbed in it, that he was not aware of the physical dimensions of space around him. Let me just explain it again from a slightly different point of view. It's explained that there are two types of, or two approaches to grasping, two approaches to revealing godliness. One approach to revealing godliness is, so to speak, to climb the mountain. As we see in the story of Moses, that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, climbed up on Mount Sinai, and there he received the Torah and brought it down to the people. Now, that process of ascent essentially means that while one is ascending, one is leaving the world. In a sense, physically, the soul leaves the world, even though the body might remain down here, but the soul leaves the world and cleaves up on high. So you're really not here, because the Baal Shem Tov teaches that the place where a person's thoughts are, that is where he is. Right? What he's thinking about is where he is. And if you think about something deeply enough, that is where you are. So that is one modality. That's one approach. One approach is to go up the mountain, so to speak, and on the top of the mountain there, so to speak, to meet with God. The other approach is the approach of the temple. The approach of the temple was to bring godliness down into the world. It says, the verse says, "V'asu li mikdash v'shochanti b'tocham." Let them build for me a tabernacle or a temple, and I will dwell amongst them. I will dwell amongst them. V'shochanti b'tocham, I will dwell within them or amongst them. That's the opposite movement. That's bringing godliness down, bringing heaven down to earth. So the first way is to rise up to heaven, and the second is to bring heaven down to you, down to earth. I'm suggesting that the Alter Rebbe went white because his modus operandi, his way of operating, was to rise up to the heavens. In order to come back, of course, because just rising up to the heavens in order not to come back is the opposite of what we're supposed to do. The story is told in the Talmud of 4 sages who went into the paradise. They went into the orchard. The orchard is a euphemism for extremely lofty spiritual levels. 4 of them went in, only 1 came out unharmed, Rabbi Akiva. What happened to the other ones? 1 saw what was going on those extremely high spiritual levels and decided not to come back. Hated to mace. He saw and he died. He remained there. 1 hated v'nifga. Other one saw and he became confused. Became confused because he didn't understand things clearly. He wasn't yet ready for the revelation he received. He didn't understand things clearly, and he became damaged, mentally damaged, or emotionally, spiritually damaged. He became unbalanced. A 3rd one hates it. He saw, and he became a kofer. And he left the faith. Right, he left the faith, became a denier, an atheist, or a denier. Without going to the explanation of why, but later on he was rectified by one of the sages. But only Rabbi Akiva went in whole and came back whole. The reason that he went in whole and came back whole is because he understood that the purpose is not to remain up above, the purpose is to come down. So when Rabbi Shneur Zalman and Zalman's soul ascended on high, it was of course with the intention of coming down and bringing back his experiences and revelations down back below. However, the Mittler Rebbe, I'm suggesting, his modus operandi, his way of doing things, his operation was to bring down heavens down to earth. His modus operandi was not receiving the Torah up on the top of the mountain, but his modus operandi was the work of the temple, the work of prayer, the work of self-sacrifice down here below. And that's why he became red in the face, which is exactly the story of the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov also, his modus operandi was to make this world a holy place. That was the whole change that he made in Kabbalah. Because Kabbalah, prior to the Baal Shem Tov, was a very lofty, elevated spiritual discipline in which one became more and more refined and reached higher and higher until eventually one reached the peak of one's spiritual abilities, and you became, in a sense, automatically kind of divorced from the world, separated from the world. The Baal Shem Tov turned things around and started the work of bringing heaven down to earth, which seems to be the primary goal of creation, the primary goal of what it is that we're trying to do. So that was the contribution or the modus operandi of the Mittler Rebbe. And that's why he went red, showing that the life in this world, that's what has to be sanctified and bringing heaven down to earth. Okay, now I'm going to take some of the questions. Do any of the sages of the past talk about bringing in the upper world and the level of this world at the same, being in the upper world, I suppose you mean, and the level of this world at the same time? Yes, definitely. Can we relinquish our soul for another? In other words, give up your soul and take another one? Possibly not willingly, but certainly it is possible for a person to acquire another soul. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ernest. I appreciate it. How do we know what message is correct for us in terms of ascending to the heavens or bringing down the heavens down to us? I feel inclined towards the heavens. But how do we know what's right, what method? I think one has to try both, and you'll see what works. Whatever works is the right method. What good could elevating be without elevating the others? You're right, absolutely right, Terry. That is 100% true. But the question is more, is elevating the method, or is disseminating the higher elevations and distributing them down below the way to do it? And again, is elevating or is drawing down the main thing? Okay, let's see here. Any other questions? I think I'll stop the recording now.